Tonight's program is going to be presented by Matthew Barton. It's entitled Stinson Records, a look at the label from its founding in 1939, the collaboration with Moe Asch of Folkways during the war years, and its subsequent history and influence in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Now let me give you a little background about our presenter. Matthew Barton is the curator of the recorded sound at the Library of Congress's Packard campus for Audiovisual Conservation since 2008, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. From 1996 to 2003, he was the production coordinator for the Alan Lomax Collection series on Rounder Records. He has written on recorded music and sound since 1981 and is a contributor to the book, The Ballad Collectors of North America, How Gathering Folksong Transformed Academic Thought and American Identity, published in 2012 by Scarecrow Press. In May, he begins his 2-year term as president of the Association for Recorded Sound Collections. My condolences on that one. He's been president for exactly 5 days.
You can see what it's done to me.
You see, and he's alive to tell the tale, coming back from Indianapolis. We'll have a report concerning the conference next month, which will be presented by Mr. Beal, who I will explain what he will be doing next month at the end of the program.
That's Dr. Beal to you.
Well, excuse me. All right. Anyway, without further ado, Matt, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. That's never happened before, but what can you do? Let me get to the proper view here. There we are. Okay. So, when Seth was reading the announcement, the word founding of Stinson Records really stuck with me for some reason. I think because Stinson was never properly founded. They became a label kind of by accident. Maybe it was always their dream, but it came about in an unusual way. Yet they managed to survive and even thrive in the terrain of the 40s and 50s, which was not that hospitable, especially in the early days, to independent labels in New York, especially if you were releasing the kinds of things that Stinson was. Now, Stinson is a name I think we all know. You're still going to find those Russian 78s in flea markets and such, especially around here. And of course, they're best known though for the folk music, most of it recorded by Moe Asch in the 1940s. And really though, it was just a name, another label to me. It gets a few lines in folk music histories and elsewhere, and I hadn't thought too much about it until about 12 years ago, give or take. I got a phone call, someone who'd gotten my name from someone who'd gotten it from someone, and said, yeah, this guy knows about folk music. And they were helping out someone in Brooklyn who had a basement full of recordings, or rather a storage unit in their basement full of recordings. And there was a connection to the Stinson label. So I thought, well, it's worth a trip. I went out there, and it turned out that they had hundreds of metal masters, as well as tapes and some papers, all of it pertaining to the Stinson record label. Not only that, these were masters, that is mothers and also stampers for all of these artists, especially Woody Guthrie. There was a huge number of Woody Guthrie discs. And the thing about the Stinson recordings is that for the most part, what's come down to us sound awful. You know, they're generations removed from the original. They've often been rechanneled for stereo and other horrible things. They just don't sound good. They were improved somewhat when Smithsonian Folkways started revisiting these things and going back to at least secondary sources that hadn't been doctored. So things got a lot better. But this, of course, you know, this is it. This is the source. You know, these mothers, these stampers, this is what you want. And long story. Doug Pomeroy, who's here, was part of it. He transferred many of all of the Woody discs, actually, and it led to this box set, Woody Guthrie, My Dusty Road, which was all devoted to the Stinson recordings. Only actually a fraction of them. I think about 50 or 60 in all are on there, but there was, I think, 2 or 3 times that at least, right, Doug? Yeah. So, because the early part of my talk is going to be about everything Stinson was doing before they got involved with well-known people like Woody Guthrie and Lead Belly and Josh White and so on. I'll start off with a song by Woody Guthrie, and this was an unreleased song that was found among those metal parts called Bad Reputation.
I fell in love with the sweetest gal in all this big wide nation. Her daddy won't let me go with her, 'cause I've got a bad reputation. I can't go with the gal I love. Now ain't that thunderation? She can't run around with me on account of my bad reputation. I kissed my gal in the dark last night. I got a sweet sensation, but I can't kiss her in the light on account of my bad reputation. When I go to see my gal, it's a pretty tough situation. I've got to crawl in at the window 'cause I've got a bad reputation. You can see the trouble I'm in, it's a pretty tough situation. Try to make love to a high-class gal and I've got a bad reputation. I get so all fired tangled up, it's a lot of aggravation. I think someday I'll catch me a train, leave my bad reputation. It seems like everywhere I go I get no consolation. Right behind I'll always find my long-time bad reputation.
Okay, so if you've heard some of the many awful releases of Stinson recordings over the years, I think that's an enormous improvement. This is 14th Street, between 2nd and 3rd. That's the old Jefferson Theater there. This is photos from 35 or 36. It's the closest thing I can find to, some photographic evidence that Stinson did business in this city. It's just barely in this photograph. Here. And you can see sale, closing, they switched locations long after this, records for 10 cents. The Stinson Trading Company basically dealt in secondhand and cutout records. They would buy them for pennies, sell them for nickels and dimes. And it was a good business. It was a place that a lot of people went, including that emerging urban character, the record collector. And this store was actually a very important source for Milt Gabler of the Commodore Record Shop and later the Commodore label. He basically, most records there sold for 10 cents, as you can see. I think Gabler told them, look, if you'll get me first crack at the things that you find out there, I'll pay you 15 cents. And that was apparently enough. So that's where it all began. And it was started by a man named Stinson, but he dies in 1938. And, of all the triumphs and sins in his name, I don't know what he would make of them later, but they stuck with that name because apparently it had some recognition. And the important people, the important names here are Irving Prosky and later Herbert Harris. Prosky went into business with Stinson at least a few years before this. He was born in Kiev in 1893. I spoke to his grandson, who was about 4 or 5 when he died, but just remembers him, said that during the 1905 revolution, he was shot by Cossacks when he was trying to get out of the family's house, run and get help. The house was surrounded by Cossacks at the time. So, quite understandably, he wanted to get out of Russia, which he did as a teenager. He was in the Midwest and in Detroit, and not surprisingly, he was a committed communist by then, and was a labor organizer, apparently worked with William Z. Foster, and got himself blacklisted all over the Midwest. So he came to New York sometime in the 1920s. In the 1930 census, he's listed as a radio salesman, and he hooked up with Stinson at some point, and they were in business together. Now, one of the things that you'll read online and in various sources about Stinson is that Prosky and Harris had the concession for records, that is for Russian records, at the Soviet Pavilion in the 1939 World's Fair. Well, I don't think that's what happened really, because they had their own business already, and the Soviets had people to do that for them, and this is who they were working with. This is a classified ad from the New York Times. Bukniga, 255 Fifth Avenue. That address was later used by the Four Continents Russian bookstore. Okay, knowing sounds. When did Four Continents finally close? I don't know. Did it make it into the 90s?
Well, Campton took it over.
Yeah, it was still there in the 80s. I remember that. Yeah. Well, anyway.
The lady who ran it was the local handler of all the Soviet spies. Her name was Ida Glazer.
Okay.
She was a total joy. She was a great deal.
Okay. Right.
Moved to another address at 21st and 4th Avenue, I think.
Okay. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this. You don't get this kind of information online.
Let me see, this is the Flatiron Building. Flatiron Building,
It was there, yeah.
yeah.
It's
Okay.
a block or two south on the
Mhm.
one class. It was on
It
the
was on the
corner.
corner of 20th and 5th.
Okay.
Big store.
All right. Well, anyway, Bukniga, if we have any Russian speakers here, you know that kniga is the word for book, so the store is effectively named Book. So Bukniga, though, had been at this location for a few years at this point, and as you can see, they are the outlet for all of the books and records and prints and so on that were going to be sold at the Soviet Pavilion. You could get them out there at the Pavilion, or you could get them at Bukniga. And at least in the case of the records, at other places around town, I've found ads for Pagani and Brother on Bleecker Street, which was a store that was there into the 1980s, and some others. I don't know if Eric Bernet had his music room yet, but he was later on was selling records like this. So, this is really who was handling the records. And the records themselves have a story. I'll just show you a couple more. These are from Soviet English language publications, more Bukniga ads. There's the Pavilion. The records themselves were especially made for the World's Fair. They had English titles on them, and they said the 1939 New York Fair on them. And I think there were about 25 of them, and they were a range of things: classical, folk music, choral, different things, mostly Russian, but some Ukrainian. I think there were 1 or 2 Gypsy and Jewish sides among those. And this was a fairly big deal because very little had come out of the Soviet Union since the revolution in terms of records. Mike, you can jump in and correct me at any time. Most of what I'm saying I learned from you. But there had been, David Sarnoff of NBC had an initiative in 36-37 sending American engineers to Russia, where they worked with their Soviet counterparts, and this resulted in major improvements in the quality of recording and of recordings in the Soviet Union. So that's what people were getting over here, and a selection was made, about 25 of them, and they were sold at Pavilion and at Bukniga.
They told me there were about 50,000 pressings that issued.
Yeah. So this was a big deal. You didn't, it's like, what was that? You don't have to be Jewish to love, Levy's Rye. Well, you didn't have to be a communist to love these records, because most of them were not overtly political. They were approved You know, they were certainly, you know, on you know, the approved, the recommended recordings, but they were not overtly political, and so they found an audience. Now, here we see the pavilion. This is what stood on top, this massive statue with the, he was known as Joe the Worker around the fairgrounds, also known as the Bronx Queen's strap hanger. Very iconic. Yeah, the Soviet pavilion was very popular. And here are some of the musicians. Some of these were on the recordings, and they were, some of them, I haven't been able to find out. Some of them may have appeared at the pavilion or were scheduled to before the Soviets pulled out. So, we know about the Stalin-Hitler Pact, which is announced in August of that year. Well, that has a very immediate and negative effect on American perception of the Soviet Union at the time. And this is that negativity is compounded in November when the Soviet Union goes to war with Finland.
Matt,
Yes.
Can you identify the artist out of there? Hillels is at the bottom.
Let's see. Well, David Oistrakh, Liza Hillels, Emil Hillels, Jacob Fleer, Marina Kozolukova.
And Hillels is at the bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's happening at the end of November, beginning of December. The other thing that happens is Bukniga gets busted. The reason for this is that they'd run afoul of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Almost everybody who worked in that place was Russian-born. And the Foreign Agents Registration Act said that if you were a national of another country in the U.S. promoting the interests of that country, you had to register, and nobody at Bukniga had done that. So, you know, the trial progresses through December. The upshot of it is, though, the Bukniga goes out of business, though it's not long before Four Continents moves into that location. But Bukniga goes out of business, and obviously they've got all of this stock that can't be sold at the pavilion anymore. And they don't have a store to sell it in anymore. Well, Bukniga is about half a mile walking from the location of the Stinson Trading Company. And Irving Prosky was a committed communist. I don't know if Herbert Harris was at the company yet. It's hard to place him at this point. So obviously had an interest in this material, may have already been selling it around town. And it just appears that you know, they swooped in and got it. So this is a notice from the Daily Worker. The Soviet Union had to dismantle that in a hurry. You could get this little pin of Joe the Worker at a bargain price.
In other words, they weren't there on at the 40 fair.
No, they pulled out entirely. Yeah, and they were dismantling it from the first week of December 1939, and they were not. The fair ran 2 years, so they were not there at all in 1940. It's one of the great ironies of the 39 World's Fair. You know, you had all these countries that got invaded, but yet they still had these pavilions there. You know, so, and the Soviet Union left entirely. So, from the December 17th Daily Worker, there we have it. Your source for Russian recordings, the ones that were at the World's Fair. Stinson Trading Company. Here's another ad a little bit later from New Masses in January. Lists some of the titles, perhaps not all of them. Now, another thing that you'll read about Stinson is that they had concessions in Manhattan movie theaters that were showing Russian films, and this is true. However, again, you know, the narrative has been conflated a lot. At the time that the Soviets pulled out of the World's Fair, there really wasn't any place, any Russian theater to have such a concession. From the New York Times, February of 1940, the negative feeling towards the Soviet Union had really killed that business in Manhattan. They're talking about the Cameo Theater, which was the primary outlet for Russian films, but there were others showing Russian films around Manhattan. There was a strong audience for this, and again, the films were not entirely political. They were very often, you know, adaptations of great Russian works or operas, even comedies, Volga Volga, is one very popular. You know, you tell people, hey, there's this really fun Russian film. It's called Volga Volga. Yeah, it's from 1937, and no one believes you. So a lot of it was really actually light entertainment, but at the same time, you would see Soviet newsreels that were sent over and so on. It was a mixed experience. So this is about just the collapse of that market, and also the big distributor that the Soviets had, Amkino, also got busted for the same reasons, foreign agent registration. They resurfaced within a few weeks as Art Kino with Americans working for them, and they were around, I think, at least until the 80s. That was who distributed Russian films, Soviet films. So they've got all these records, and they're selling them in their store and apparently through other outlets in the city, but they don't have those concessions yet. But let's actually hear one of them. This is what the World's Fair records looked like. And you'll still find these. I think one of the things that testifies to the popularity of these recordings and of the later Stinson Russian recordings is the fact that they are not rare. You will still find them, especially around here, but elsewhere. They had good distribution for that stuff. So here we have one of the 1939 fair records. This is called Sports March. It's from a 1937 film called Goalkeeper.
Ну-ка, дождик теплой влагой, ты умой нас огромною рукой, напои нас всех отвагой, и не в меру горячих успокой.
Okay, so at some point in 1940 or 41, Stinson starts to run out of these, and they decide to stay in the business, pressing their own versions of these, which look like this. And they appear to have just been dubbing the records. They had no access to masters at this point, and they don't. Here's what the same record sounds like. A little noisier. Might even be a little faster.
Ну-ка, дождик теплой влагой, ты умой нас огромною рукой, напои нас всех отвагой, и не в меру горячих успокой.
This is the Miami Theater, also known as the Miami Playhouse. It was located on 6th Avenue on 47th Street, and as you see, they're advertising old-time movies. They had started as an ethnic movie house showing mainly Greek films, and then had a more eclectic policy, and then somehow got the idea, perhaps from the popular silent film screenings at MoMA at that time, that they would show silent movies. And they did this for 2 years with pretty considerable success. They even had live accompaniment. Now, it was not considered one of your mainline theaters. It was a 500-seat venue. Sounds big today, but that was very small at the time. And it was well away from Times Square and the big places. But still, they did well, but constantly with a constantly shifting booking policy. And in 1940, they decided, well, let's see if people will come see Russian films again. And so, in November of that year, they went back to them. And they actually did fairly well with this. By that time, there was kind of some pent-up interest. Several films have been made in the Soviet Union, including some films that kind of papered over the Stalin-Hitler pact. But there was an audience ready for them, and apparently, I haven't found any confirmation of this, but it would seem that they were selling Stinson records at this point, the only motion picture theater outlet for such a thing. Now, in June of 1941, Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and that changes everything. This is from less than a week after the Hitler's invasion. Suddenly the Soviet Union is cool again, at least in Manhattan, and So you see this from the newspaper PM. It's a very amusing article, but people were just ready for this. And here's just a little nugget. On the day of the invasion, the Miami Playhouse was showing a Russian film called They Wanted Peace, which was an attempt to, I don't know how you would say it, an attempt to make nice about the Stalin-Hitler pact. I don't know if they actually got around to screening it that day, if they had the news first, but, one of those little ironies of history. So, the Miami is showing these films and doing well with them, and they start to pop up at other theaters around New York. And in September, the Stanley Theater, 41st and 7th, gets into the act. Here's the Stanley in the 1920s. Another shot from the 1930s. It's the smaller building there. And they show Soviet films from November of 41 through the end of 1955. And they have it's a somewhat larger place, I believe 650 seats, but they could get a lot more in there if they wanted to. They once got cited for having 1,000 people in there. Now, at this point, an interesting person enters the Stinson story. His name is Noel Meadow. His real name was Leon Blumenfeld. Leon spelled backwards is Noel. Blumenfeld can be translated as Meadow. He was a press agent through the 20s and 30s, and he handled a number of bands around New York and was known for his publicity stunts. He had quite a sense of humor. This is an article that appeared in 1941. He had something called the Screwball Society of America. And he's one of these people, these name just keeps turning up once you know it. And he looks to me, I can't prove this, but he looks to me like this kind of person who may have brought the different people together in the Stinson story, because he was a publicist for the Stanley Theater, and he's a name that you see on actually Stinson records like this. Seth Winter brought this. We have notes by Noel Meadow. And what Stinson started doing, in addition to simply repressing the World's Fair records, was issuing songs from Soviet films that were coming over at the time. They were lifted from the soundtrack. I don't know if they were taken directly from the release prints, or maybe they got separate reels, but this is what they were doing. And you listen to them, and they've been balanced to play in a theater, so they can sound a bit odd for that reason. But the films were popular, and the songs were popular, and the Stanley had a store on the second floor mezzanine. Seems to have been there, for the entire run of the theater. And when you went to one of these Soviet films at the Stanley, there would be an ad telling you to go to the store. And they would even play one of the records from the film behind that ad. And Herbert Harris seems to have operated this store. So we're now in 1942, and Stinson starts releasing albums like this, which is just what it says, Soviet songs from Soviet films. And I don't know if you can see it, but once again we have Noel Meadow writing the notes. And these are popular albums. I can't give you sales figures, but the fact that one still finds them and they pop up on eBay and you see them around, and there's one. Seth, where did you find that? Do you remember? It just, you find them, they're around. Yeah. So, to me it speaks to a certain level of popularity. And then you encounter things like this, which is that in 1942, Mark Blitzstein starts doing a radio show called Russia is Singing for WINS Radio. And these are the lyrics to the song of the Red Army Nurses, also translated as Red Army Nurses Arrive at the Front, from the film The Girl from Leningrad, which was remade in an American version a couple of years later. I don't know how well you can read that. Blitzstein also liked these songs, which performers were themselves active in the war effort. The number Arrival of Red Army Nurses at the Front from the movie The Girl from Leningrad was sung by an actual nurse at the front. This is from a recent Blitzstein biography. So there's that. Fred Waring, of all people, did a song from one of these films. This is from a Billboard notice. He actually performed this song on his network radio show. Moscow Strikes Back, very popular film. Released in an American version with narration by Edward G. Robinson. So, here's Stinson, thriving in an unusual way, making records in an unusual way, and it seems to me quite possible that they may have received technical assistance from the man on the left, Moe Asch, later to found Folkways Records. Moe Asch, as you may know, was an engineer, and he'd operated a radio shop in Brooklyn for many years and had built the studios for WEVD. He'd have been a good person to help you with the unusual task of dubbing film optical tracks onto commercial discs. And so everyone is together by now, possibly with the assistance of Noel Meadow, Irving Prosky, Herbert Harris, Moe Asch. Moe Asch has been trying to put out records of his own, and he's made a few releases, including one with Leadbelly, but he hasn't sold much. And then war breaks out, and shellac, which is what you need to make 78s, is rationed. And your ration is based on how much you pressed before the war. Well, in Moe's case, very little. Stinson, however, had been pressing away, and again, numbers are elusive, but it seemed like there was enough to go around for the two of them, because at this point, Stinson's only had access to Russian recordings were these films. So they could keep up with that, and there was something left over for Moe as well. And that leads to records like this, Burl Ives.
Ox went out on a chilly night, prayed for the moon for to give him light, for he'd many a mile to go that night afore he reached the town, oh, the town, oh, the town, oh. He'd many a mile to go that night afore he reached the town, oh. He ran till he came to a great big pen where the ducks and the geese were put therein. A couple of you will grease my chin before I leave.
Now, the folk scene was not real big at this time, but it was a scene. And it included European folk music, Russian folk music, and it also included folk dance.
He grabbed the gray goose by the neck, throwed a duck.
That is Burl Ives on the right there. I think this is they're doing some kind of Polish dance here. This is an interesting little book that came out in the 40s. Gives you extensive instruction on how to do various European folk dances. And it even has a discography, what you should dance to. Now, Stinson is not represented on the discography, and they had not put out much dance music. All of their Russian records really were, they were opera, they were folk songs, choral things, just not, ooh. I knew I needed to cut out of that sooner. Okay, so I thought you'd enjoy that picture of Burl dancing. Another artist that Moe Asch brought in, Josh White. One of his Stinson albums. This is one of the emerging styles in folk music, that both Ives and White, could sing in a very soft and appealing manner. And they could approach a wide range of material with it.
One meatball, one meatball.
Some other artists that Moe Asch brought in, Mary Lou Williams, Woody Guthrie, of course.
One meatball.
Another Woody album.
He told the way
Lux Lewis.
Near at hand, the simple
Carlos Montoya, who was largely responsible for introducing New Yorkers and Americans generally to flamenco guitar, and a very popular performer around New York in those days. Jazz pianist Art Tatum. It's a notice from New Masses, 1944, the last Roosevelt campaign. Mary Lou Williams, a Stinson artist, and down the lower left, the new Ash album releases. The records continued to come out on the Ash label that Moe had started, but sometimes they would come out as combined Ash Stinson releases.
The waiter hollered,
And I can't really find a pattern between the two.
"You get no bread with one meatball, one meatball, one meatball. Well, you get no bread with one meatball." The little man felt
This is what one of the combined labels looks like. Now, this is one of the Russian records that they were still doing through this whole time. This one I would date to 45 or 46 because they've started the 3000 series. Prior to this time, the Russian records that they released, they would simply put the number that it had had in Russia on the disc. So, there's no sequence at all to those, and a number of those came out with new numbers as part of the 3000 series. This is the Piatnitsky Women's Ensemble, they had at least one side among the World's Fair records, and this was I believe, an ensemble that predated the revolution. It is still around in some form. Very popular in the Soviet Union and pretty popular here, and actually more influential on the folk scene than people realize. Ethel Rame, for instance, who runs the Center for Traditional Folk Music and Dance, formerly known as the Balkan Arts Center, remembers being greatly influenced by hearing the Piatnitsky Women's Chorus. So let's hear just a little bit of that.
На закате ходит парень возле дома моего, поморгает мне глазами и не скажет ничего. Никто его знает, зачем он моргает, зачем он моргает, зачем он моргает.
Who's the hymn on that song?
Any translations, anyone? I don't know. So, it's late 1945 now. The war is over. Shellac is no longer rationed, and Moe Asch is starting to chafe at his business arrangement. However, he needs money to capitalize his next venture. He has bills to pay, and so he's looking towards the exit, but he needs to raise money. Around this time, he hooks up with Norman Granz in California, and Granz plays him one of his live jazz jam sessions that he calls Jazz at the Philharmonic, and Asch just flips for it. He sees enormous potential in it, and he's really the first person in the business who does see potential in it, because Granz had shopped it to the major labels, and all they heard was, the crowd noise and musicians making mistakes. They didn't, tune into the energy and the live improvisation that was going on. So Asch acquires it for Stinson. It's released at the end of December and starts taking off in January. You find a lot of reviews. It sold strongly for Stinson through 46 and 47. It was one of the first two things that they put on to LP when those were introduced in a couple of years. Really, it's a perennial, probably Stinson's all-time bestseller. So, to get out of his deal, though, Moe has to sell everything that he's done for Stinson back to them, all of the masters, and this is how all those Woody masters wound up in Brooklyn. And so Stinson is then left with a pretty nice back catalog, things that are selling well, and which will continue to sell for them over the years as interest grows, especially in artists like Woody Guthrie, Leadbelly, Josh White, and others. So they get through the next couple of years in pretty fine style from what I can see. from interior of one of their albums. These are most of the 78 albums that they released, and this was all done, in a 3 or 4 year period. You'll see the early ones are all Russian, but then you start to see Woody and Josh and others. Also a lot of cantorial records, which Moe Asch had recorded for them, and they continued that, recording cantors who were around New York, and even licensing things from overseas. Give you an idea of the popularity of these artists in New York at the time. This is a concert series at Columbia. 3 concerts are listed. 3 of them, Josh White, Burl Ives, and Richard Dyer Bennett, are Stinson artists. I mentioned the cantorial recordings. This is a really interesting one. Lengyel was a pre-war refugee. He arrived in the U.S. And actually sang in 1940 at the New York World's Fair. He had made some clandestine recordings in Germany in 1935. And Stinson issued them. They say it's an exclusive. Lengyel stayed in New York and was cantor with some different congregations around here. These recordings really languished for a long, long time until ARSC member Rainer Lotz assembled this behemoth of a set called Beyond Recall, which is all the Jewish ghetto recordings from the 1930s and 40s. It's really an extraordinary piece of work. Now, the Noel Meadow leaves Stinson late 1947, early 1948. His place is taken by Herbert Harris's son, Robert, generally known as Bob. This is, I believe, a draft press release. I don't think it was used, but it talks about the Cuban recordings that he made for the company in 1948. There were several sessions in Cuba in 48 and 49. Some of them under assumed names. They refer to an orchestra called Tropicavana. Well, that's actually Sonora Matancera, one of the great Afro-Cuban orchestras. This is Stinson's listing of all of their releases. This didn't last very long for them, but it was a way of dealing with the 1948 AFM ban. They could record orchestras overseas, issue them here, and there was a ready market for this music in New York at least. They did more than 40 releases though. And they did a number of other things in 48 to deal with the recording ban. They released an album featuring Canada Lee and an a cappella chorus that was a tribute to Sojourner Truth. They licensed some early recordings of Phil Harris, a very popular band leader at that time. Harris was not too keen on having this stuff out again, and they ended up fighting a costly lawsuit about it, and I think the records were eventually withdrawn. The other thing that happens in the late 40s, of course, is that the LP is introduced. And I think after living high for a couple of years, they got hit with the twin issues of the recording ban and having to retool for the LP era. And so things like this brief foray into Latin music ended. They stopped doing things like cantorial recordings. They really tightened up considerably. And I can't tell exactly when they stopped pressing 78s, but from 49 on, everything is going into making LPs, that is 10-inch LPs of their back catalog. There's very little new recording going on at the time. Fortunately, they've got some things for which there's still demand. The first things that they put out are Jazz at the Philharmonic, Burl Ives, and Carlos Montoya, whose popularity was still growing at that time. And the other thing they do, the Russian records continue. They start a Ukrainian line. And they're well positioned where they are in Union Square because that's near a very large Ukrainian neighborhood. Still is a Ukrainian neighborhood over in the East Village. And interesting thing about the Ukrainian records, whereas the Russian records by and large were dubs, either from films or of records released in the Soviet Union, there's a lot of original material in the Ukrainian series. And this is one. It was recorded in Canada. Only seems to have come out on Stinson. You know, I believe this was all on the up and up. Here we have an ad that appeared in a local Ukrainian paper for Stinson Recordings. And here's really a neat recording from a Ukrainian group in Canada. Now, the other thing that happens around this time is they decide to double down on folk music. This is the Folksong Trio. They recorded a version of Tom Dooley, and I'm frustrated because I don't see my sound cue. It may have become decoupled or something. I'll try and play this for you, perhaps at the end of the talk. This is recorded, Roger Sprung says this recording was made in 1950. People date the release of this album to 1953. However, it appears in Schwann in the summer of 1952, and the recordings were made not to tape but to disc. So I can actually believe that it was made in 51 or perhaps even 1950, and that's significant for the careers of Roger Sprung and the other members of the group. Eric Weisberg and Bob Carey went on to form the Terriers, one of the most important early folk groups predating the Kingston Trio, that is, folk revival groups.
Bound to die. I met her on the mountain, there I took her life. Met her on the mountain and stabbed her with my knife. Well, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh boy, you're bound to die. This time tomorrow, reckon where I'll be, down in some lonesome valley, hanging from a white oak tree. Well, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh boy, you're bound to die. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh boy, you're bound to die.
And that version of Tom Dooley, and this is a good example of, I think, how Stinson, misplayed their hand over the years, although it's an odd story. Of course, the Kingston Trio, about 7 years later, would have a huge hit with Tom Dooley, and they had various stories about how they learned it. But Ron Cohen, the folk music and political historian, realized that, wait a minute, it sounds an awful lot like the one that the Folksong Trio put out, and there's a distinctive pause, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, when they sing it. I'll play it for you at the end. And he asked Dave Guerd, and he acknowledged that was a source, at least. But the members of the Folksong Trio didn't know this either, so it just went by. So you will not find a re-release of that song on a Stinson single in 1957, or this album reissued with a sticker on it. The original Tom Dooley, it didn't happen. A missed opportunity. So here's a page from Schwann, 1953. You can see that Stinson has re-released a lot of their early, their back catalog, especially the Woody, Josh, and others. But they're doing a lot of interesting things in new releases. The Jewish young folk singers, who have the honor of recording the first version of We Shall Overcome, not on Stinson, but for Hootenanny Records a few years before this. And this is a group that included a lot of people who became significant in the folk scene later, including Ethel Rame, who I mentioned earlier. And then there's this. Lord Burgess was Irving Burgess. He was American, but he specialized in West Indian music and later became close to Harry Belafonte and was an arranger for him. This is a record that he did for Stinson in '54 with Jamaican and West Indian musicians.
Not a cent, not a cent, not a cent to pay rent. Oh, not a cent, not a cent, not a cent to pay rent. Now I woke up this morning, at the door was a knocking, a man with paper in hand. He said, you're back in your taxes, your mortgage it lapses, you'll have to give up the land. So we sang it, oh, not a cent, not a cent, not a cent to pay rent. Buddy, oh, not a cent, not a cent, not a cent to pay rent.
Some careful placement there. Will Holt died recently. He got a nice obit in the New York Times. He was better known for his work on Broadway, including The Me That Nobody Knows, than for actually many records that he made in the 50s and 60s. He wrote Lemon Tree, which was a hit, and he also co-wrote the MTA song, the one about Charlie on the MTA. But he was a Stinson artist, did 2 albums for them, as did Milt Oken, a very significant producer later in the 60s and 70s. Holt, I think, was under the spell of artists like Richard Dyer Bennett at this time. There were a lot of these records in the 50s. What was it? Songs of Dalliance. Ed McCurdy did these sort of naughty folk records, the slightly off-color ballads, and this was one.
Come buy my new ballad, I have it in my wallet, but 'twill not, I fear, please every palate. Then mark what ensueth, I swear by my youth, that every line of my ballad is truth, a ballad of wit, a brave ballad of worth. 'Tis newly printed, and newly come forth.
I haven't been able to prove this yet, but I think Stinson released the first album of Indian classical music recorded in the United States. Others had been released, but they were licensed from overseas. Balakrishna lived in New York, actually not that far from here. He was part of Harlem's small but significant East Indian community in the 1950s. On the left, we have a picture from the Herald Tribune covering a concert that he did in 1953. And you can see those pictures were repurposed for the Stinson album that was recorded and released the following year. Another noteworthy Stinson artist, Paul Clayton, did 2 albums for Stinson. He was a significant influence on Bob Dylan. By this time, Stinson was working with Kenny Goldstein, the budding folklorist who used to come into their shop in Union Square, and eventually helped them write notes for the early albums. And through Goldstein's connections in England, Americans got to hear Ewan MacColl for the first time.
All on the bowling, my bully ships are rolling. All on the bowling, ho. All on the bowling, the kitty is me darling. All on the bowling, ho. All on the bowling, kitty comes from Liverpool. All on the bowling, ho. All on the bowling, it's a far cry to payday. All on the bowling, ho.
And through this whole period, they're releasing Russian records. This one is kind of unusual. As I said, most of the Russian records were dubs, but this one was recorded in New York, apparently by Stinson. This was a musician who emigrated to New York in the 1950s, and this is the only thing I've ever seen by him. You don't get much when you Google that name, although maybe if I did it in Cyrillic, I'd get more. However, it's a neat little record. He's an accordionist, and he does a jazzy version of Dark Eyes. Looking at the gatefold of a Pete Seeger live album that he did for them around this time. It was a double 10-inch. And Stinson stuck with the 10-inch format longer than they should have and really got caught napping. So they had to do a lot of repackaging in the late 50s, something that I think really set them back. This is one of the last Stinson albums, and one of the only 12-inch albums that originated, was born on 12-inch. A singer named Dick Silvera. And apologies for the poor quality of this picture. I don't know if you can see. That's Dick Weissman, who went on to start the Journeymen with John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas, and has written numerous very good books on folk music since then. I spoke to him about this. He, again, was one of these people who just dropped into the store one day and struck up a friendship with Bob Harris. At that time, Kenny Goldstein had moved on to greener pastures and was not only writing notes, but producing and directing sessions for labels like Prestige and Riverside, Folkways, many others. He was really one of the big people in folk music by that time, and I think that Harris was hoping that Dick Weissman would fill that gap for him, and he did do some very good work. He plays guitar behind this singer on this record, but he also was writing notes for Stinson albums, and they're quite good. The Stinson repackaged most of their back catalog on 12-inch LPs at this time, and in some cases they actually added tracks. In other cases they just expanded. And you see like a lot of space between the cuts on the Stinson albums from these times. However, one thing I'll say about those records is that they often sound better than the 10-inchers, because the work was being done by David B. Hancock, who I think that's a name that people, you'll see DBH scratched in the dead wax. And Hancock went on to do a lot of really high-quality mastering of classical music on vinyl. And he was given
Question, when was that picture taken?
probably 58. The record came out in late 58.
Was that kind of like the porch where they did that famous Harlem portrait of him?
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't that look like that?
Well, it's not the only stoop in Harlem, though. So
Yeah, it looks kind of familiar.
that's a choice one, though. Yeah. So as I say, you know, it's often these 12 inchers from that time that are the best sounding releases of Stinson at that time. In most cases, he was able to go back to the master tapes, and also they're being pressed on quality vinyl at that time. The earlier 10 inches are often on a really crummy black plastic.
That was David. He had very strict specifics of what pressing plant he went to for him to put that logo in.
Yeah,
He
yeah.
even did our early VRCS record.
Oh, really?
Record collectors.
Yeah, yeah. But at that time, Bob Harris decides to close the Stinson office in New York. There has been a Stinson distributorship since about 52 or 3 in Los Angeles, being operated by his sister and brother-in-law, and it's not entirely clear what happens at this point, but they are not getting along. And within a few years, Stinson, that is Harris, Bob Harris, dies, not yet 39, from heart disease. And his sister and brother-in-law carry on Stinson and are re-releasing the back catalog, but in most cases they do not have master parts to work from. Those appear to have stayed in New York, in Brooklyn, in that basement, where they were when I saw them for the first time about 12 years ago. The building that housed Stinson for the longest period of time, 27 Union Square, stood at this spot. It was torn down in 1959. So, the end.
Did you buy that batch of records?
Sorry?
Did you buy that batch?
They were eventually acquired by the Library of Congress. Yeah. Thank you, thank you. I was having a Jeb Bush moment. Please clap. Yes.
The Soviet connection, was it just expedient? Were they just, were they true believers in communism? Or
At that time, yeah, they were, Prosky and Harris, definitely, they were party members. Yeah.
And then it kept making money for them, so what the hey, they just kept doing it.
Yeah, essentially, they made between, it's hard to tell because they, so many records came out more than once, but they did at least 400 Russian discs and perhaps over 500. And the Ukrainian series, they released over 200 discs in that. So yeah, they're known for these folk music recordings, which sold in small numbers, but which made money for them. But it really appears that the life's blood of the company, what really kept them going through hard times, were these Russian and Ukrainian discs.
Amazing. And everyone was one of them, right? I mean, they were not just during the war, but say when it became less popular to be aligned with the Soviets.
Right. Well, again, they weren't all political. Most of them weren't. A lot of them were of great Russian opera singers, Sergei Lemeshev, people like that, who had strong followings in the U.S. and elsewhere. And these recordings were hard to get. Otherwise, they were dubbed off by other companies. There was RG, there was Kismet, which was down on 14th Street, but I don't think any of them had quite the resources or the network that Stinson had. Stinson was able to sell their product overseas. They had very good distribution in that way.
The store that you mentioned early on in the talk, the one on 14th Street.
Yeah.
Do you know what year that store continued to exist until?
36, possibly 37.
All right, so, because I'm thinking about a store on 14th Street on the north-hand side of the street that's still...
Okay. This is actually the south side of the street. Yeah. So, Doug.
Yeah, I was hoping you would talk about the damage to the records in Brooklyn, intentional sabotage.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you ever found out exactly who did that. 46 discs that I
Mhm.
examined, and most of which I transferred.
Right.
33 were obviously damaged by the same person
Yeah.
in the same way.
Yeah, taking like a key or a screwdriver or something like that, and just taking the metal part and just going like that, you know, so that you'd have this, you know, the every time the stylus would hit it, you get a big pop. No, that's one of the great mysteries, that this had been done to some of the discs. Now the discs got around. It's a very complicated thing that happened at the time that the company was that Asch was leaving the company. That period of transition, because a lot of the metal parts were actually at a plant in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and you know, it went back and forth. This is in some of the Asch biographies. It went back and forth. You know, are these your masters? You know, no, I think they're mine. You know, back and forth. Nobody was quite sure, you know, who owned what. And my best guess is this: that it's at some point, you know, one of the parties, you know, made a claim, and they told the pressing plant to do this, you know, that they would take, you know, okay, you can send them, you know, just as a sign of good faith, I think, you know, to say like, okay, you know, we're returning this damaged so that nobody can use it, you know, because the ownership is not clear. Strictly a guess. Yeah. I mean, has anybody ever encountered that, you know, finding metal parts that were scratched?
Closest thing was at Columbia. There was something called YMW 16-inch presses, and they were usually dubs of session lacquers, which were done on 16s.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mahler first with Metropolis in Minneapolis, we had a YMW for 3 sides, and we had nothing else to it. And it looked like it had a nail that went across it.
Hmm.
And I had to dub it, and at that time we used Sonic, and they sat there and manually declicked every revolution, and that's what wound up in the Masterworks Heritage.
Yeah,
So that's the
faster
only-
than a razor blade, but not by much.
Yeah. But the only thing close to that I've seen was on some V-Disc sessions of Benny Goodman and Red Norva, where there was on the Blackers, if it was a take they didn't approve, they would take a grease pencil.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that I've seen that. Yeah.
right. I figured a way of getting it off. Sometimes you hear dubs of it, and you hear there's just noise running through, and you hear that, you know that noise from a grease pencil
Mhm.
as it's going around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing, and this is just a theory, you know, that it may have been some kind of good faith thing to say that, like, okay, I don't own this, but I paid for that part, you know, so you got to make your own. So it's returned to me, but scratched. And if there's ever a question, you know, if it turns up in a bootlegger somewhere, you produce that and say, no, I couldn't have done that. You know, look at this.
Yeah.
So.
It was they pressed it and then said it's destroyed.
Yeah, that's just a guess. Yeah. Deal.
Okay, there's a whole genre that pops up later than this, maybe in the 60s, the Red Army Chorus and Marshia
Yeah.
Ballet Dance Company, and a popular Russian style music, usually with big voices.
You think of the records that came out on Monitor in this country? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, one thing I didn't get into.
Outgrowth of these early Russian.
Well, yeah, you know, it was, you know, there was an audience for it, and it had been, you know, maintained over the years by Stinson and these other labels. And I think actually that was one of the things that was hurting Stinson in the mid to late 50s, was they were starting to have competition. Of course, Elektra and Folkways were at, you know, and Stinson could never match their output. But also around, I think, 57 or 58, Monitor gets going, and they're putting out a high quality product. You know, they're you know, it sounds, you know, much better than anything Stinson is doing, and they're in nice color covers, and they're stereo, and so on. Yeah. So.
I remember there was a store on Broadway around between 12th and 13th Street. This would be about 59 or 60, named Eichler's, a big record store. And I remember untold numbers of Stinson records in the bin, so maybe they unloaded a bunch of them with Eichler.
I think so, that sounds, yeah, because they, you know, they Harris moved to California, and I think, yeah, he just decided at that point he was going to get out of that business. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, then there would have been quite a large inventory. Yeah.
I don't remember the popular folk, I remember a lot of Russian stuff that didn't interest me because it was all choral,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but the opera singers interested me.
Yeah, yeah. Terry?
There's one to make the observation when you mentioned monitor, I brought this back. The way Meshkaniga worked, there was an office that had a complete set of submasters in every one of the socialist republics.
Mhm.
There were, so the master was made in Moscow with Oistrakh. There was a submaster in Kiev, all over, which meant that a label like Stinson may think they have the exclusive coming from Moscow, and Monitor is getting it from Kiev,
Mhm.
the Ukrainian Republic. I know this for a fact because I encountered it when I was representing a licensee here in the United States in the early 80s, when things had started to fall apart. And the contract said non-exclusive. I changed it to exclusive. Was bounced back. We can't give you exclusive. I said, why not? And that was how I found out that this is the way the Soviet republics had already always worked.
Mhm.
There was no concept of, if you will, exclusive rights or private ownership. And once Gorbachev came into the, and then it all disintegrated,
Mhm.
it became the wild, wild west.
Yeah.
And I suspect it started very early because there were
Mhm.
Oistrakh recordings that appeared on Monitor.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm sure the Soviets simply wanted, they simply wanted the widest possible distribution outside of the Soviet Union for this material, and I think Stinson understood that, because at the same time that they're getting into this in the 1940s, Keynote is putting out some of the same recordings, and you start to see labels like Kismet and RG. I think Stinson simply endured.
And of course, before the copyright law was amended in 1972, when you published a recording, your only legal recourse against infringement was the misappropriation of another's intellectual property. It was a common law right.
Yeah.
It was not statutorily protected.
Yeah.
That complicated the matters even greater.
Yeah, I think Stinson's main advantage was simply that they were in New York. They were working with Noel Meadow, who was working for the Stanley Theater. They got the first crack at these films that came over, so they were probably the first ones on the street with these records. And as I say, for various reasons, they endured. They outlasted their competition in the 40s, but they didn't have an answer for what Monitor was doing in the 50s. Michael?
Stinson, I don't think, ever had any arrangement, any agreement with the Russians at all. Around 1947, the NK started importing or exporting selected recordings all over the world. In 1952 and 53, when they went to LPs, it really started to pick up a lot more. You go to other countries, and actually if you look at some of the publications from MK, they would have an exclusive record distributor, a record dealer that usually was a bookstore, because MK is Mezzodromia Naya Kniga. They were international books. And so they had two distributors in the United States. One was in San Francisco, one was Four Corners. In Canada, they had Ukranska Kniga, and then there was another store in Toronto. I went through a warehouse. 1972 was when they had another big push to export records from the Soviet Union. I went through Ukranska Kniga's warehouse, and there were tens of thousands of Soviet pressing, Soviet LPs, and the minimum order was 200 copies. You couldn't just, a store couldn't order them. What they would say, if you were a record store and you wanted to sell Soviet records, you'd have to go to the United States representative who had ordered 200 copies of the record, and you would hopefully be able to get them, because if they ran out of them, they'd have to order 200 if they were still in print.
Yeah. Well, In the 40s, at least, Stinson definitely dealt with Art Kino, the distributor, and they are credited on some Stinson releases. And they also dealt with, I believe it was called Amrus, who acted as an agent for Soviet books and records, and so on.
But that was not the record company, because the records that are here that Stinson was putting out are not the records that you'd find in the Soviet Union.
Right, but my point is they were dealing with someone. They weren't just, they weren't simply bootlegging. Later they did bootleg, and you get all these recordings on Stinson that simply say, orchestra with chorus, or just say folk song or something like that. There's no credit to an individual or to an orchestra or anything like that.
So the Soviet record industry is parallel to anything that Stinson was doing.
Right. Yeah, but they were, what I'm saying though is in the 40s at least, they were going through channels to do these things, and there was an agreement about they would press in certain numbers, and that a certain number of copies were sent to Amrus and things like that. So they were going through channels such as they existed at the time. Later on, I think it's straight up bootlegging that's going on, because there's just no credits on the records.
Yeah, because you could find legitimate Soviet pressings all around the world through the 40s and the 50s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and one thing I didn't include this in on a slide, but some of the records they put out were credited. They say they give you the information, who's singing and what, but then below that they say courtesy of Misha Balanov and his Zvuki Rodini, which I think Zvuki Rodini means Russian sounds or Russian style, something like that. And Misha Balanov had a radio show devoted to Russian music. He was a Communist Party member, and he was on the Brooklyn station and some others from the 30s forward. I talked to Henry Sapoznik about him recently. He said he was also a Yiddish vaudevillian, an interesting fellow. And the records that say that would seem to have come from Balanov's own collection, and it really sounds like it, because some of them are really, they're dubs from very worn records. So some of the things they were putting out, were probably no longer available. So it was just one way to get them. And when you're putting out these records with, just these generic credits on them, there must have been some word of mouth. You went into the Stinson store, they would say like, oh, that one, yeah, that's Lemeshev. You take that, you'll like it. But they weren't going to put the names on the label.
I know I have a Coliseum record that I got when I was about 14 years old with Rimsky-Korsakov arias, and there were 2 performances on there that were also on Stinson. So
yeah, they got around.
Matt, do you have any idea who did the metal part work and pressed these 78s over the years from one company?
Yeah, I think a lot of it was done by Clark in New Jersey, who also did work for Moe Asch. Yeah, I mean, you remember we had dinner last year sometime, and I just found a Stinson record somewhere, and I showed you, the cymbal scratched and the dead wax. We passed it around the table. I was hoping somebody could identify it, because there was a very distinctive, whoever was doing the work would draw this little bird next to the matrix number. And you see that on almost all of the Stinson 10-inch LPs, and you see it on the Russian 78s.
The equivalent of David Hancock.
I suppose, and I know they were using Clark at that time, and Clark was around into the mid-50s. Oh, yes?
One of your record labels on your slides, around the bottom, it said, made by Midtown Record Company.
Yeah, that was Stinson. They stopped using the name Stinson Trading Company, and they reorganized. Midtown Record Company was the sort of the manufacturing end of it, because the thing is that through all that time they were also running a record store out of the same location. So there were a couple of different companies under the same roof, and Midtown was the one actually manufacturing records that came out with the Stinson label. Yes?
You mentioned Keynote. Was that equivalent competitor to Stinson?
I think they only, competed directly with the Russian recordings and maybe a few folk items, because Keynote put out some recordings on Pete Seeger and a few other.
Stranger also.
Yeah.
And that Columbia also had.
Yeah, that came out late 30s and it went nowhere at the time. But by 44, when the Stinson album was done, Burl Ives was doing pretty well. He was on network radio and, had a good reputation. So that Stinson album came out and did well, and it actually prompted Columbia to reissue the earlier album that they had done on him.
Didn't they put that on LP too? A 10-inch? That Burl?
Stinson? Oh yeah.
I think I've seen it.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's that with that cover. That's one of the first LPs that they did. Yeah.
Hey,
Anyone? No? Okay.
more questions? Everything's been answered.
All right.
Matt, once
Thank you.
again, thank you.